Check 1, 2. Test 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
Yeah.
Well, Donald, congratulations with your new album.
Thank you.
Tell me something about the dream car. Why is the title of the dream car Kamakiri?
Well, a Kamakiri is Japanese for praying mantis, and it's a fictional car. I found it in a Japanese dictionary, and because the story takes place in the near future, I had to invent a car, and this car is called a Kamakiri. It's a very interesting car. It's got a bionic farm in the back. It's steam powered, very clean driving. I envisioned it as it's not a fast car. It probably goes about 40 miles an hour, and it's got a link with a satellite called TripStar, which is a acronym for teleologic routing satellite, and at least in my mind that's what it stands for. And it really, in fact, the satellite is leading him to his destination, which is unknown in the beginning of the album, and in fact it's unknown at the end of the album as well.
But do you think that steam-driven cars are the future?
Well, I don't really know. It wasn't really a projection of what the actual technology might be in the future, but a kind of a fantasy of what technology might be. And I wanted, I wanted a car that would be, a clean car, because this guy's sort of supposed to start with a sort of clean soul, and when he innocent or naive, and as he makes this journey, he things change for him.
Do you see Kamakiriad as a concept album? Are all the 8 songs related together?
Yeah, very much like my first solo album, The Nightfly. The songs are loosely related. I think that you can't make a record that's as detailed as, say, a short story or a novel, because the medium just doesn't bear it. There would be too much exposition, too much didacticism if I tried to explain everything. So there's just a loose connection between them, and I think the first song introduces the narrator, the car, and the concept of this journey he's about to take, which seems, you get the idea it's going to be dangerous and possibly fun, but you're not exactly sure where he's going. And then the 6 following songs are adventures that he has along the way, and he finally ends up in a town called Flytown, and that last trip is described in the last song, which is called Tea House on the Tracks.
But in which picture of time are all the stories happening?
Well, I envisioned it as taking place in the near future, somewhere around the millennium, somewhere around the year 2000. And I did this because I think, I was always a fan of science fiction, and I think one reason is that it allows you to be detached from the subject you're talking about to some extent, and also allows you to invent technology which can serve as metaphors for whatever you want them to be.
But are you obsessed about Century's End, about fin de siècle? Because you had already written a song about it, changing of decades, decenniums?
I don't know if I'm obsessed with it, but I'm certainly interested in it. I think everyone's interested in it. It's has a lot of mythic intensity. Like, some people think it's going to be the apocalypse, and there's I guess people who are apocalyptically minded, like, say, our ex-president Reagan, have a very intense feelings about this. I myself feel that the best you can hope for is, I think, probably there will be a change going into the 21st century, and hopefully it'll be, humans will adapt to the new environment as my character does.
But do you see similarities with the change from the 19th century, the real fin de siècle, in this world?
Yeah, I think it's hard to make an easy comparison. I think because for one thing, I think the 19th century, as someone mentioned, was a century of sentimentality, while the 20th century is turning out to be a century of irony. So you really have a different sort of orientation. I think that psychic orientation. So I think irony. The question is whether irony is a sign of decadence or a sign of sophistication that might lead to something more positive. It's hard to say.
Why did you ask Walter to produce the album?
Just before I went in to record the songs, I realized I wanted someone to bounce ideas off and to help me. For instance, I'd be out in the studio singing, and if no one's there to help me, I have to keep running back and forth. So it's kind of, you have to keep changing hats. So since Walter had just finished producing a Ricky Lee Jones album, he had the timing worked out, and he agreed to come in and produce it. And it was a great idea, as it turned out, because our experience is very much like it used to be making a Steely Dan album. In fact, it was actually much better than that. So it worked out really well.
And was it also the reason why it took such a long time? You have to wait for Walter to finish the album?
Not really. After the Nightfly album was released in '81, I suffered a writer's block for a few years. It was very hard to write songs, and so I took some other musical jobs for a while until in the late '80s I got this idea for the Kamakiriad album, and most of the time that went by was really a time of reflection for me, and as I say, I was found other useful things to do until I felt like doing another album.
Yeah. But you released from 1972, you released almost every year an album till 1981 or till the beginning of the 80s. And after that, was that some kind of a gap for you, or just a writer's block, no inspiration?
Well, in a sense, I think that those first albums were fueled by a kind of youthful energy, and I think at some point you run out of the energy of youth, and then you have to really live some more in order to have something else to write about. I wasn't interested in writing, releasing albums that had no meaning to me or were repetitive, so I really just had to wait till I had something else to say.
But can you call it a struggle to get the same success as the Nightfly, or wasn't that the case?
No, it didn't have to do with success, really, in the sense of
pressure.
No, not at all. It was more a matter of I have no control over my creative, very little control over, it's hard for me to induce a period of creativity because it has to do with your life and what you're living. So, it was just hard for me to be able to synthesize, what I was going through at the time into some kind of art. It just wasn't happening.
Is the true story that you have to spell your name when you found a record company after a few years? Hi, this is Mr. Fagen calling.
Yes, that's actually true. In fact, just the other day I called Warner Brothers and I still had to spell my name. So it doesn't really matter anymore,
But was that frustrating for you, or?
Not really. I was never. I don't think I might be narcissistic in some sense of the term, but I don't really have that kind of ego, and where, it would bother me. I thought it was funny. It didn't really bother me. it's really a trivial thing. There's probably other things that would, be humiliating to me, or it was mainly a struggle within myself. And I guess the thing that bothered me most was, just having people, ask me when the record was coming out over a period of 3 or 4 years became very frustrating, because I always had the same answer: is I don't know. Do you know? I don't know. Do you have any ideas? So it was that was a little frustrating, but I'm not bothered by that other kind of stuff. I remember Walter told me a funny story about sometime in the 80s he went into some record company office. He was going to produce a record there, and he was introduced by someone as, "Hey, here's Walter Becker. He used to be great." So you get used to a lot of crassness and vulgarity when you're talking to record business people.
But you always carry your past with you as a musician as you are.
Well, it's really if you're secure enough, those kinds of things don't bother you.
Do you think that writing songs for you is nowadays less or more difficult than in the 70s?
I think it's probably more difficult, but it's more satisfying, because I think I have higher standards, and I'm more conscious of what I'm doing, and I know more specifically what I'm going for. So, for instance, I think the Kamakiriad album came out pretty much exactly the way I imagined it. So even though it was harder to write the songs, I think it was worth it.
And is today's technology an advantage for you?
Only in the sense that after I write the songs, which I do on the piano, I get to arrange the songs on using some fairly simple sequencing equipment, and with that equipment I can make a model of the song to show to the musicians. So it's helpful in that way. Otherwise, I don't really. Technology for me is convenient, but it's not essential.
When you take a listen to the early Steely Dan albums, it still sounds as if they are made in the 90s.
Yeah, they sound good. We were very careful. Roger Nichols, our engineer, was a great engineer who liked clean recordings, and Walter Becker was always interested in audio, and we always had a nice clean sound, I think.
And that's why you make the decision to work again with Roger.
Yeah, Roger's he's not only an engineer, he's an inventor, and if we need a piece of equipment that doesn't exist, he takes a few days off and then brings some funny looking piece of equipment in the next day.
How much are American people interested in the lyrics?
American? I think people listen to the albums on different levels. Some of them are interested in the music more than the lyrics. I think there are some serious fans who sit down with the record and give it a real good listen, and I'm not saying that they have to absorb the album in one listening, but I think over a period of listenings that it can be. I'm hoping that it could be valuable to understand, or at least absorb the lyrics.
But you are famous for your lyrics. Are you sometimes considering, maybe not too difficult, or too difficult for the listeners?
Well, I've tried to make them more lucid as time's gone by. I think that too much exposition, too much didacticism in a song can make a song dry and boring, because they are theatrical songs, and I do try to tell a story, but on the other hand, I don't think it's hard for a 6-minute song to bear the weight a lot of explanation. So people sort of have to make some connections with their imagination. But I think the general feeling and the general story comes across.
But when you are releasing Tomorrow's Girls as a single, it's just one piece out of the whole story. Doesn't that bother you when it's only that song which is played on the radio?
Not really. I think the songs pretty much stand by themselves as well. You know, it's just not. It's in a different context, and I think the songs, especially maybe with the exception of Tea House on the Tracks, the last song, I think they're self-explanatory. Tea House on the Tracks, I think, was written as a kind of finale to the album. So that song might be dependent on the rest of the songs to understand it.
But is Tomorrow's Girls some kind of the same theme as, for example, Hey 19, the gap between two generations?
I don't know. It's more about the gap between men and women, generally speaking. I think the literal story is sort of like a bad science fiction movie in which the Earth is invaded by women who replace the women on Earth, and the idea is it's really a metaphor for the idea that when relationships start to go bad between a man and a woman, you'll wake up one morning and look at your girlfriend or your wife, and it'll seem like you don't know her, as if she's from another planet, as if she was an alien. And that's I think that at least certainly happened to me once in a while. I don't, and other people tell me the same. So I think it's, when people grow apart, they become aliens to each other. So that's really what the metaphor's about, and it's kind of made a little comedy out of it.
But
science fiction comedy.
Yeah, but it's a personal story.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of the songs are based on my own experience. They're not directly autobiographical, but maybe we should answer the phone.
Try it. Well, but that metaphor is combining two themes: the reality and the ASF, the science fiction.
Well, yeah, I think the science fiction story that I'm telling is a metaphor for something that really happens in life, and that's just the idea. Sorry. Just answer it, I guess.
Hello. No, we are just doing an interview. This is Peter.
I'll get it.
I'll get it.
Yeah, I know where it is.
Okay, no.
I'm right in the middle of the thing. Okay, in the same place.
Hij wordt gebeld door zijn vrouw.
It might be like a little after one, but there you go.
Well, just a funny coincidence talking about relationships.
That's right. There it goes.
Tell me something about the video, because I heard somebody is doing your part in the video, in the Tomorrow's Girl video.
Well,
Rick, or?
Yeah, I just finished a video. I think of videos as advertisements. I don't think the way I like to listen to records is just to without any images, because I think I like when the listener brings his imagination to what he's hearing. I grew up with the radio, and that's what I love radio. So that's what I like, and but nevertheless, for the purposes of advertisement, I was involved in a video of Tomorrow's Girls by what seems to me to be some very competent people, and what I chose to do is, although I do appear briefly in the video, I have a friend of mine, Rick Moranis, a comic actor, and he essentially plays me in the video. So, at least as an actor doing what he does best,
But is that a funny view when you see somebody doing your job?
Well, I think he's doing his job, and my job was to write the song. And I think hopefully the thing it'll come out, it'll be funny.
Tell me something about the way of recording Kamakiriad. You record Walter and your part first, and afterwards the other musicians.
Yeah, pretty much. First I put some keyboard parts down, and then Walter will sometimes put the bass part down after that. But essentially, it's mostly keyboards, and then we'll overdub the other musicians. Mm-hmm.
But was that the way of working you were used to, or is it a completely other way?
Well, of course, on most of the Steely Dan albums, there were live bands playing in the traditional way of recording. I think we started working this way on the Gaucho album, and I continued to work this way in the Nightfly album. And now with the improvement in technology, I was able to do it in a much simpler way. Because of the technology, I'm able to make a model of the tunes and play it for the musicians, so they know specifically what I'm looking for.
Do you see by your own this album as some kind of a Steely Dan reunion, or isn't that the case?
I don't really think about reunions or nostalgia very much. It's I think what is Steely Dan? It was a creation of it was started as a band led by Walter and myself. Then the band broke up, and we preserved the name Steely Dan through the end of the 70s, and if anything, I think Steely Dan is connected in my mind with the 70s. But since people now think of it as Walter and myself, we're just there's no reason to toss the name. And but as far as the reunion, Walter and I wrote together throughout the 80s, so we've never had since we've never had a real split, we can't really have a reunion.
But are there well, that's true. But are there plans to revive the Steely Dan name?
Well, we are going on tour under the name Steely Dan just this summer, and it'll be Walter and I with a new band. Mm-hmm.
But do you like it to tour nowadays, because you weren't that much of a road warrior?
No, when I went on the Rock and Soul Review tour last summer, it was so much easier to tour than in the old days, because in the old days we were mostly opening for other acts, and the conditions of touring were not very good. But now, when things are organized well, it makes it much easier.
Mm. What kind of things has changed for you? Only the organization, the people in your surroundings?
Well, everything. Just when we used to open for like a lot of other bands, heavy metal bands, the Beach Boys, Chuck Berry, everybody. And when you're the opening act, you don't get a proper sound check a lot of the time. You're low man on the totem pole, and now we're like, sitting on top of the totem pole, so maybe we'll get a decent sound checks,
But how many gigs are we talking about? Only in England or in the rest of Europe?
Right now it's just the United States tour. We'll be out for a month, but as things progress, we might expand it to Japan and possibly England and the continent.
But you're looking forward to do it. You like it to play it live after the Soul Review?
Oh yeah, I've always loved to play. It was the traveling and the just the conditions, and we used to have to play in gymnasiums and bad halls with terrible acoustics, and things have changed a lot since then.
Well, was it nice for you to do the Rock and Soul Review with Michael and Boss?
Oh yeah, it was great. It was just like being in the circus. Had all these performers that would come out one right after the other, and then and I was sort of the MC. I was sort of the ringmaster,
You were the front man.
Front man,
yeah. Yeah, I heard you were highly surprised when you hear the live mix of the end result.
Yeah, I think we did a show at the Beacon Theater on 2 nights in March of '92, and I was really surprised at how polished the band sounded. We had a terrific band, and I thought that the album, the live album, was very good. It was a marginal project, so you know, it didn't sell a lot of records, maybe 300,000-400,000, but I thought it was terrific, you know, and I think that, you know, it's a shame there's not more of an audience for that kind of music.
How would you describe that kind of music then?
Well, it was, you know, music essentially from the 60s and early 70s. I think it was all the people in the band, Michael McDonald, Phoebe Snow, Bob Skaggs, and myself, grew up with that music, and that was really the original reason we went into music, because we wanted to play funky music. And you know, it wasn't the authentic versions, but it was some kind of, it was we tried to get the feeling as best we could, and it was fun.
Do you think that there's a difference between your colleagues from the 70s and the 80s, like Boz and Michael McDonald, and today's musicians?
I'm sure there is, but that's, you know, I don't know that much about music. I don't listen to the radio hardly ever, so I don't really know.
But do you recognize some kind of evolution you went through as a musician?
It's hard for me to compare with what's going on now, since I you know, just don't know much about what's going on now.
But when you compare the music scene, today's music scene, the early 90s and the 70s, are there great differences?
The only thing I'm aware of is that because the radio play, at least in the United States, is so narrow, because the formats are so confining, you know, you don't hear any kind of eccentric music. Like when we debuted in the early 70s, there was a sort of a window of a few years where various sorts of eccentric music were played on the radio, and I think that window slammed shut sometime in the middle 70s, and went back to the kind of 50s, very tight, you know, tight playlist. And I think right now business is controlling the music, and it's a shame.
It's only making money,
as far as I can tell.
But will your new record be played on American radio? Is there a radio station for that kind of music?
We'll find out. We'll find out.
But are there radio stations which you want to be played by?
Well, I don't really see. I don't even know that much about radio. When I was first was in the music business, there was only a couple of formats. There was you know, rhythm and blues stations. There were some jazz stations, and top 40 stations, and then what they used to call FM stations, which was the stations that we were played on mostly, although we did have a few hits that made it to top 40, but essentially we were played on what was then alternative radio or FM format. But now there's so many formats, you know, they have all these acronyms, all these, you know, there's AOR and suburban contemporary gothic and things like that. I don't know what they are, you know, so it's hard for me to say, really. I'm just not an expert in it.
But how would you describe the Kamakiriad style?
I think it's suburban contemporary gothic. SCG.
But isn't that a shame that you have to label all the music?
Yeah, I think there is. It is a shame. And it's too bad there aren't any suburban contemporary gothic radio stations.
So you won't be played on radio?
Not at all.
When you look back upon your career, are you the most enthusiastic fan of your own old material, or?
No, I don't like most of the old material. The only place I ever hear it is in restaurants, for one thing, and or shoe stores. And I think it belongs in shoe stores, a lot of it. Some of the early stuff sounds kind of juvenile. I think we evolved a lot as we went along. And some of the later Steely Dan albums, I think, have some good stuff on them. I like Asia. I like Katie Lied. I thought it had some nice tunes on it. And The Night Flight my own Nightfly album. But usually I'm really concerned with what I'm doing now. Like even Kamakiriad now is not that much interest to me. I'm through with it. You know, I mixed it, I mastered it, and you know, and it's no longer in my hands. So,
So this is part of the job, but nothing more.
yeah, it becomes a point where I mean, a few months ago it was the most important thing in my life, but now it's not.
What's now important in your life?
My wife and the material I'm working on now.
Is it for a new solo album or a music score or film score?
I'm not sure. I've just been writing tunes. I've been developing music that I'm interested. I don't have any specific ideas except for specific songs. I just have music that I've been working on.
Have you ever heard the combination of Billie Jean by Michael Jackson and the Do It Again medley by Clubhouse?
Years ago, yes. I remember there was a dance record. Yeah, I liked it. It sounded like a good dance record.
Are people allowed to take old Steely Dan records and sample it, or?
As I remember, that wasn't a sample.
Well, it wasn't a sample, no. That they just played the theme.
Yeah, right. On the other hand, we are sampled quite often by rap groups and other groups. De La Soul has sampled us, and Ice Cube. I think it's hard for me to criticize sampling. I understand the aesthetic case behind it. I think it's fair that we be paid if they actually use the actual recording in some way, but they're free. I think they're free to use the material and alter it.
But today's youth only knows the samples by James Brown and not the real man.
Yeah, that's true. Well, hopefully, maybe it'll turn into something. Who knows? I grew up with the idea that creation should be original. That you should really work hard to to develop a style and come up with something original. And there's an argument, of course, that nothing's original, that people just take pieces from other things they've heard. So, I think that with the development of digital technology, on the other hand, it does change the rules to some extent. I know my partner always says the information wants to be free, and maybe he's right.
Have you already heard some things by Walter's new solo album?
I've heard a few songs, and they're great. I think they're great. It's he writes in a very different style than, say, I do. His songs are much more conversational, and they're very funny, and I think his album is going to surprise everyone. He's a great singer, and this will be his singing debut, really, on record, and I think his album's going to do really well.
Are you also involved in it?
I might go out this summer and do some playing, but it's pretty much his creation.
And he's a good singer.
Oh, I've always loved his voice. I always used to try to persuade him to sing. In fact, I was when we couldn't find a singer in the beginning to sing the songs, it was kind of a contest, between us as to who would be the singer. I voted for him and he voted for me, and he won. So,
so that's the only story behind your singing.
Pretty much, yeah.
How do you see today's political situation in America with the new president, Mr. Clinton?
Well, so far he, I think he's doing a good job. I'm, generally the kind of policies that he seems to be pursuing are the kind of things that that seem kind of thing I'm for. I voted for Clinton in hope that he would pursue some of these policies, and he at least seems to be trying. So we'll see.
But how's today's situation? Are you still living in New York, or?
Yeah, I live in New York.
But what kind of situation is it? Is it bad, or?
Well, it's hard. You mean economically? I don't know. I really don't know. I know that the most important thing, to me is to solve the racial situation, or at least something which I don't know if it can be solved, but it certainly has to be addressed in some way, and hopefully Clinton will address it, at least in the sense of providing money for education, so on, that the Republican presidents withdrew. So we'll see what happens.
How do you think back on Mr. Jeff Porcaro?
Jeffrey was a great drummer. It's too bad that he, was taken before his time, as they say, or I guess it was his time, actually. But he was a great drummer. He was very enthusiastic, and I think, he changed the way a lot of drummers play. I think he was very original, and it would be hard to find someone to take his place.
Do you believe that there's only one perfect version possible of a song, only the most definite recording?
No. I think there's infinite versions that would be successful, but not in the case of my songs. There's what it is, I have a favorite version. I think there's although there may be many successful versions, I have something very specific in mind, and what I try to do is to, execute. Let's not use that word. It's a little too negative. I try to build the song so that the end result is what I imagined, and I think I've been most successful in that on this album, Kamakiriad, and so far when I play, I've played it a few times. It sounds great to me. I'm sure next year I'll start to find little flaws in it, which is what usually happens, and then I'll never play it again. Because I'll be working on something else by then.
Thank you, Donald.
Thank you.
Do you mind doing some station ID?
No, sure.
I'll write it down for you. So I'm Donald Fagen, and listening to my magic friends George and Peter on Radio 3. The next one on Radio 3, and I'm very glad that my new album, Kamakiriad, is CD of the day. Sorry.
And you're listening? And you're listening to my magic friends George and Peter on Radio 3, and the other one is...
Hi, I'm Donald Fagen on Radio 3.
And I'm...
very glad that my new album, Kamakiriad, is CD of the day.
Okay, so this means I'm Donald Fagen?
Yes.
So I'm Donald Fagen, and you're listening to my magic friends George on Radio 3, and this is... Say this one once more.
Hi, I'm Donald Fagen on Radio 3.
I'm Donald Fagen on Radio 3, and I'm very glad that my new album, Kamakiriad, is CD of the day. Okay. Hi, I'm Donald Fagen, and you're listening to my magic friends George and Peter on Radio 3. Okay, and the other... Hi, I'm Donald Fagen on Radio 3, and I'm very glad that my new album, Kamakiriad, is CD of the day.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Do you mind signing these?
No, no.
I'm not having CDs available.
Yeah, I don't have them either.
You don't have any either, huh?
Not yet.
I have to wait and see. Just a Warner copy. Okay, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks. Okay.
Yes.